And this is Sharon Firebrace, and this is the midweek review. We've got a special concentration at the moment on that which is coming up, which is May Day. That is coming up on the 1st of May. This is a big celebration for the working people of this nation. Lest we not forget the price that's been paid by the workers and what is ahead of us for the working people of this nation. I've got with me on Skype, we must welcome Ros McClellan, and she's the General Secretary of the Queensland Council of Unions, known as the QCU. Welcome on board, Ros.
G'day, Sharon.
And here on my left, I've got Len Cooper, and he is the involved with the, of course, the Communications Workers Union, and has been actively involved, and is also a member of the Victorian. We are both members of the Victorian union, not union, but Mayday Committee. So very important for us here, a very significant time in the agenda. Let's look at it, both Ros and Len, the issues confronting May Day. Let's look at some of the history first. I mean, there's a lot that's being involved for the public at large, but let's look at the issues as we see the history of May Day. I mean, obviously has enormous relevance to today. Why is May Day relevant to today in 2016? Ros?
Sharon, there's lots of reasons, I guess. Firstly, from a historical point of view, it's the 125th year that Labor Day has been celebrated and observed here in Queensland. It's always a huge event. There's 30,000 people that march in Brisbane and probably 40,000 across the state. And why it's relevant today more than ever is it really represents a day in which the community can celebrate the fact that union values are community values. So those values of a fair go, of creating a better society, of giving a hand up to those that need it, and continuing, I guess, to push forward on the things that really keep working people up at night, things like jobs, things like health, education, public services, keeping our public assets in public hands, making corporations pay their fair share of tax, making sure that every kid, regardless of their parents' pay packet, has the opportunity to fulfil their potential in life. These are the things that we hold dear today as ever.
Yes, indeed. So they are relevant today as they were in yesteryear, of course, as we can see, particularly as we see the populations, the workforce up around about 10 million now. But at the same time, too, we see some dramatic changes, particularly from the time of John Howard on. We'll discuss that in our time here. But let's look at it, Len. Why is it relevant from your perspective? You're working at the Victorian end. Why is May Day relevant today?
Well, first of all, I'd like to endorse everything that Ros has said. She's absolutely correct about May Day. In Melbourne, this is the 122nd May Day. It's been celebrated for 122 years. And it grew out of, as it did in all countries, it grew out of the oppression of striking workers in the United States of America a long time ago, where 6 workers were shot in the streets when they were protesting for a reduction of hours from 48 a week to 40 a week. And so that translated into a worldwide movement to establish May Day as a Workers' Day, where we could demonstrate the issues that we're concerned about, and Ros has done that very well, and where we can actually look at our program for the years ahead to see how we're going to defend the majority of Australian people and other workers in the world.
Yes, indeed. So to defend the working people, I mean, obviously May Day has at its heart and its interest the working people's needs. And of course, I mean, at the heart of this is obviously the 8-hour day. A very significant monument, is it not? But a very significant time in the working calendar for all in the workforce. Why is the 8-hour day a significant day, Len?
Well, I think, again, as Ros has said, in terms of jobs and health and welfare of the working population, technology's long past the time when there should be reductions in working hours, so that we create more jobs and workers can get time to improve their health and do other things. And so the issue today really should be back on the agenda, the shorter hours question, because in fact what the employers are doing day by day is forcing workers to work longer hours without overtime, sometimes longer hours without even getting paid. And so rather than hours being reduced in workers' interests and in society's interests, they're actually increasing. So it's very relevant today and it should be debated a lot more.
Yes, indeed. So we're finding though that the scale. I mean, we're now working on a 24/7 model, are we not, Ros? I mean, this is the big concern. We've slipped out of and been pushed out of the 8-hour day, the 40-hour week, into now a 24/7 working week. Why are you concerned about that, and why is that a big issue during, of course, May Day?
Well, I'd say, Sharon, probably two things. I agree with absolutely with the excellent point Len's made about people being squeezed, about people's, blood, sweat and tears, their precious leisure time and family time being stolen, to be blunt, being put in the profits of big business rather than, being, people being paid properly what they're worth and for the time that they work. There's another side of the coin, though, that I want to draw out, and that's about all those people in Australia who are on insecure work arrangements, who are waiting basically at home with their lives on hold, waiting for a call from the employer that they do have that next casual shift. People ready and willing to work, but not being afforded the security of a permanent job, being put on back-to-back contracts, being put on, I guess, non-traditional forms of employment arrangements that make it really difficult for them to feel that they can have a strong voice at work and a control over their destiny. So as unions, we're really worried about those folks too. And the next thing I wanted to draw out on that question is the issue of weekend rates, the issue of penalty rates, because as we know, they're under attack. And Sharon, as you rightly pointed out, to the increasing, 24/7 work cycle, we've got to always remember that people that give up their precious family time with friends, miss out on special occasions, don't see the kids often when they get home from school, that's precious, and it's precious to all workers. It was absolutely appalling for the Productivity Commission to insinuate that some workers' time with family and friends is worth compensating and others not. Now, anybody can see through that divide and conquer technique, that it's okay for nurses, paramedics and those type of workers to get penalty rates, but it's not okay for shop assistants, retail workers and folks in hospitality. Workers aren't fooled. How long do nurses and other groups of workers think that they can hold on to penalty rates? They can't be an island of protection, I suppose. If it's lost for one, it'll be a very slippery slope before it's lost for others. And it does small business in the neck as well, because if these penalty rates workers don't get or have a reduction in their take-home pay, what's the first to go? It'll be, the going out on the weekend for a meal and a movie. It'll be money that you no longer spend in the small business down the road on a coffee catch up with your friends. That'll be the first to go. So it's economic stupidity, and it attacks the very essence of the Australian way of life.
Yeah, well, it appears at the very outset you both said that the big concern here is the multinational corporations, top end of town, big business. It's really that's moved and pushed the boundaries, got a bigger grip on government itself, even sitting in cabinet itself, and some of those outside through privatised companies now being able to now develop some of the policies. This is what the big concern is, as profits are being driven and not conditions that you've both highlighted here that are very significant and very important. So, the 8-hour day, if we slide too far out of that into a 24/7 where there are no limits and boundaries. I mean, how far are we from a sweatshop? How far are we from the Asian sweatshops that we've condemned before in the past? Len, your views on that?
Yes, I think really one of the things, all those things that Ros has highlighted, it's one of the reasons why this federal election is so important. We have to defeat the national government, the federal government, because all of those things will be intensified. The attacks on workers and the casual labour and so on will be intensified. And so we really find this May Day's got to be a demonstration against the federal government, and let's hope they're tipped out of office. And I think we have to say to the Labor opposition that they've got to come up with some very firm policies supporting workers' conditions, some of which they've announced, but some of which they haven't announced yet. And so I think we need to keep the pressure on the politicians generally in that regard. And I think that on the Melbourne Mayday agenda, the other things that the Melbourne Mayday Committee wants to emphasise this year is opposition to the phony free trade deals that the federal government is entering into, like the TPP. Even though the government's adopted it at the moment, it hasn't been adopted by Australia or the Australian Parliament and other parliaments of the world, so the pressure's being kept on. And we want to make this Mayday a protest against that. And then, of course, this year's the 50th anniversary of Pine Gap. So the issue of foreign bases in other lands and in Australia and an independent foreign policy is a big one on the Mayday agenda in Melbourne as well. So I think that that we see that as pretty critical for this Mayday, that series of issues and demands. And as you say, it's Workers' Day, and this is the time for us to display those.
Yes, indeed, and but also the budget that's certainly before us with this election we're embarking upon. As soon as we're told, when of course, we've got the budget that's primary to all this, and of course the election that will follow. Obviously we've been committed to something like a 74-day election period. It's one of the longest in history. But the important thing is really the policies that have not been placed on the table. So those policies obviously impact and affect the public and the people. So, again, if we get too much of a control and a push by the big multinational corporations into the seat of government, into government decision making, then obviously this is where we find that the workers do suffer, and that of course wages diminish, hours increase, and then of course the quality of life starts to deteriorate rapidly. So let's look at it. Ros, the issues arising, obviously nationally, the workers' conditions, the workers' pay, etc. We're heading into an election. You mentioned about the Turnbull government, the Liberal National Conservative government, from the time of Mr. Howard on, has been very much an attack on workers, has it not? How do you envisage, should a Turnbull government be retained? What can be expected of the working people generally?
Absolutely, the Turnbull government should not be returned. The main issue here, as far as Queensland unions see it, is jobs. That's secure jobs, it's decent jobs, it's jobs that are underpinned by a fair-minded industrial relations system. And the second issue, it's about making sure that corporations pay their fair share of tax to adequately fund the social agenda that affords universal, high quality and easy access for any member of the community to health, education, higher education, great public services and the like. Unfortunately, the Turnbull government and the coalition federal MPs only seem to be concerned about their own jobs. So the issue of Australian jobs, going overseas through arrangements like TPP and the China Free Trade Agreement, the issue of overseas workers being exploited when they're brought here by businesses only concerned with their own profit and bottom line, is an absolute disgrace. So too is the lack of attention and lack of compassion and care and support that the federal government is showing to our regional communities in Queensland. These are communities where youth unemployment is nudging 20%, I kid you not, and they're the same areas where excessive work visas are provided to workers from overseas, student visas, 457s in industries like hospitality. Young people are ready and willing to do that job, but obviously want to do that job, for a fair award or EB rate. I'll talk to you about the community of Townsville, which is in North Queensland, near to where I grew up. Townsville's unemployment rate overall is 7.1%, with youth unemployment nudging 20%. 237 workers have recently been sacked from Queensland Nickel. There are 580 meat workers who've been stood down for 4.5 months, the longest end of season shutdown for over a decade, at the same time as their jobs are literally floating by on ships in Townsville Harbour due to live exports. 160 rail jobs have been lost, 178 jobs at the Telstra call centre. This is all in Townsville. And there's absolutely crickets. You will hear crickets from the federal member, Ewan Jones, who only cares about his job. And it's the same story all throughout Queensland. So, yeah, you're right, Sharon. There's a lot to be done on that front.
Yes, it's very challenging. I mean, obviously, and obviously the big problem with the Turnbull government, the Conservative government, is that they haven't had any policies that they've placed on the table. The policies that have been placed on the table have been pulled off the table. But the big concern is that there are policies that are not in the public's interest, the working people's interest, but they're more in the top end of town, from what you're saying, and from all reports and all the data and the readbacks are actually coming. So the big concern, as you've said, Ros, is the number of youth unemployed. And I think in parts of Victoria, it's something like about 25%. That is of grave concern, totally, and must be condemned. And we're looking at unemployment generally around about 6.3%. They did argue at the beginning of the year it was around about 5.9%, but it's crept back up to 6.3%. That's of grave concern. And as you're saying, as industry and corporations are going to the wall, in particular, I think one of the reports coming back just recently, and that is that the banks and their involvement with, of course, big corporations. They are corporations. They are making something like 32, 34 billion profit per annum each of the banks through their investments. But we're seeing as well, and this is where jobs are collapsing, where big corporations are collapsing, where government's putting too much investment and too much trust in big corporations. We're seeing that they've gone to the wall. Arian is one of them, one of the big steelworks, of course, and we're seeing Peabody Coal Giant. These have gone to the wall at something like nearly 900 million each, and the banks have certainly had investments in that. We're seeing that Westpac and NAB have gone under with Dick Smith when that went under, and when it was floated on the share market, and of course it was floated at too high a price, it busted it. Slater and Gordon, Westpac and NAB have obviously gone under with those through their investments. Too much investment. Are they too big? Are they too big to break? Are they too big to bust? Are we going to head back to a global financial crisis with the banks? Has the government been blinded, in particular the Liberal National Conservative government, the Turnbull government, that have had big involvement with the top end of town, with multinational corporation investment, and particularly as now we're seeing they're defiantly resisting the call by the ALP in particular into an investigation, into a Royal Commission investigation into the banks. Is this, Len, to you, is this an exposure of the fact that the government is too close to big business?
Yeah, I think, Sharon, that this is the best issue for the public to have a look at, to decide what sort of government they'll get if Turnbull is elected. Yep. I think Turnbull is an ex-merchant banker. They're running like mad from any decision to really have a genuine investigation into corruption in the big banks. And now they've reverted to a scare campaign saying that if you do that, the banking system will collapse. Well, if the corruption is so rife in the banking system, then it is time we started from scratch anyway. I think the thing about it is that this scare campaigns are nonsense, but we do need to get to the bottom of it, and it won't be gotten to the bottom of a former banker who's mates with the top end of town. And that's a fundamental question, because the other issues flow from it. The attack on penalty rates, the attack on workers' wages, the attack on jobs and workers' conditions, all flow from that. So I think the public really need to have a look at that issue alone to know what sort of government Turnbull will be if he's elected, and we'll actually be back to the Abbott agenda, or worse, if they get elected.
Well, there we are. Would you like to add to that, Ros? I mean, in terms of the banks and their involvements?
Just to, I guess, agree with Len that the Turnbull government isn't just too close to big business. They're absolutely held captive by them. They're their, LNP members. They're their donors. Big business is the one that feed this government, and they are paying them back handsomely and in abundance. So much so that they are, running like crazy from, the Labor Party's call, but also backed by good, independent senators like our senator in Queensland, Glenn Lazarus, by the ACTU, in calling for a federal independent commission against corruption that shines a light on all areas of Australia's institutions, public and private. So we won't miss the politicians themselves. We won't miss government. We won't miss certainly the banks and big corporations. So if they think that the ABCC is such a fabulous idea, let them have it in abundance. Let them have it in abundance, because right now they're trying to run an election on the dry gully that is the ABCC, rather than the issues that really matter to working Queenslanders and working families all across this country. The ABCC means that building workers have got less rights than an ice dealer. Apparently that's okay if you're the Turnbull government, but try and call big corporations, banks, businesses to account, politicians to account, and watch them run screaming from that kind of public scrutiny.
Yes, indeed. It's time for public scrutiny. I mean, obviously, this is what the public are wanting. They want scrutiny, do they not? This is all part of May Day. This is obviously what May Day is going to be. This is the 1st of May. This is the rallying of the working people nationwide, listeners, that's going to be rallying at all points right throughout this nation, Queensland especially, across in West Australia, New South Wales, Victoria. And it's the people of the world really unite. I mean, it's also happening globally, as we're seeing really that that the economies particularly in the Western world, privatisation has obviously brought the economies down, brought them into the control and captivity of corporations, major banks, big banks, investments, and we're seeing too with infrastructure development, we're seeing that the wealth that should be due to the public and the people are now marching out the door and being slid into the pockets of the rich and into the multinational corporations. The story hasn't changed. I think this is a century-old story. But what we need to do is understand and comprehend its impact on us now in the reality of 2016, to know that the struggle is the same and the action and the direction is pretty much the same. And that is, we need to have policies that are going to be for the public and for the people. And we haven't seen any of those policies placed on the table in the public's interest coming out of the Turnbull government. We haven't seen them from the time of John Howard on, and in particular Mr Abbott, from what all accounts and all the information that's presented to us. This is of mass concern. Len, let's look at it. We've got an election coming up. We've got obviously a lot at stake. We've got a government, a Turnbull government, that is prepared to call a double dissolution on a fake purpose and reason being the behaviour of the unions, whereas really what's really toppled that has been the reality, and that is the behaviour of the banks, the misbehaviour of the banks, the too big to bust type mentality, the fact that most of the budget has gone into their direction. Let's look at from superannuation that's been proposed to a GST upon the public. This is all in the interest of the big banks. And also, as we're seeing, infrastructure development is for them to get 8.7% on every investment, which is going to work against us. That's millions, if not billions of dollars against the public. So, Len, let's look at it. This is... the collapse of the big banks, the defence by the Turnbull government to defend them, the fact that there's an election coming up, the fact that there are very few policies on the table that are in the public's interest. The public are fighting back. There's been a mass fight since 2014. It was the public that did them in, that got rid of Mr Abbott. Will this be the same with Mr Turnbull? Will he be a one-term government?
Well, I don't know what the outcome of the election will be, but I certainly hope so. And I think that the point that Ros has made there, if you look at the Royal Commission into the banks that's been called for, I mean, there's no doubt in anyone's mind about the corruption. We've seen the examples of it over several years. It's been exposed for everyone to see, and that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. So the government, on the one hand, refuses to have a really serious look at that. But on the other hand, it wants to bring in the ABCC legislation against building workers. And I think it is important to re-emphasise what Ros has said. Part of the provisions of that Act are that workers don't have the right to silence. So if the inquisitors are after them and they don't want to tell them what happened in the meetings of the union members and who said what, they're not allowed to do that, because they get automatic jail time for refusing that, or certainly they're charged for so they have no right to silence, and they have no right to a lawyer of their own choice. It's appointed for them by the state. So these are rights that are basic fundamental rights that criminals enjoy, but building workers are going to have that used against them. And I would argue, as a communication worker, that once that is in with the building workers, that will be flowed to other industries and other workers. And so we can't allow a government that's going to trample on our democratic rights like they are with the ABCC legislation, and yet not do anything about the banks that are rorting.
Yes, and this is what we need to look at, Ros. I mean, we saw really the stoic, upper house of federal parliament, the Senate, actually defend the public from the 2014 budget on, and the issues raised here just now with Len. The Senate, the fact that the Turnbull government went to big lengths to really minimise the rights of the Senate, raised eyebrows and major concerns in terms of democracy. The practice here of attempting to bring in an ABCC like an iron lung upon the worker and upon the workforce and attempt to destroy the unions, is this not getting into taboo territory? Is this not getting into STASI type police
Right.
upon workers? This is not dictatorship style conduct of a government.
If Sharon, if this is a window into the future of what Australia is like under a Turnbull LNP government, then I've got to say it's a pretty scary view. I mean, Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, if he were to be re-elected, we really have to take a good hard look at ourselves and think, who are we as Australians? What do we stand for? How is it somehow okay that one group of Australian citizens, building workers, get treated far less favourably than any other group? And if we let that stand, my question to everybody is, who's next?
Yes.
How relaxed and comfortable are you as an Australian citizen if this is going on at your front door? Building workers today, who's up tomorrow? And I've got to say too that Malcolm Turnbull does a very good impression of a pretty smooth and slick salesman, but underneath it, there's a right-wing nutbag, just as there was with Tony Abbott, make no mistake. The only thing that Malcolm Turnbull has delivered is Senate voting reforms. Just extraordinary. Out of all the issues keeping Australians up at night, Senate voting reforms really is what you're going to put as the string in your bow. Is that right? He had a go at testing the waters about an increased GST and pulled back sharply when he saw the community outrage at that kind of proposal. Ditto, tried it on with reducing time with, for mums with their new bubs and families to have at home by taking away paid parental leave rights for women on Mother's Day, no less. That was announced. Again, the community outrage, he pulled that back. So there's been lots of toes in the waters, lots of insights, that we can draw for what he's got in mind for Australia. But what's he actually delivered? Beating up on building workers and trying to bully the Senate by introducing Senate voting reforms. Just shameful.
Yes, indeed. Well, in a democratic country, we're looking for a leadership that's going to support the people and support the public and support the public's interests. This is what we're needing, and that is there's been no policies put on the table in our interest to benefit the public at all. As a matter of fact, from 2014 on, it's all been about raid the public, raid the pensioners, and I think get reports from the National Commission of Audit, the Business Council of Australia, and the ACCI, the Australian Chamber of Industry, etc., and their recommendations. They're actually writing the policies of the nation, and those policies are counter and contrary to the workers' need and the public's needs. It's very radical. There's been mass rejection. There's been war in the trenches. There's been the public disputing the 2014 budget all the way through. The toppling of a Prime Minister, Mr Abbott, occurred along the way. The imploding of the political party, that is the LNP, the Liberal National Conservative Party, occurred along the way. And now we see that the shine is wearing off on Mr Turnbull. We're seeing that he's 2 points behind the ALP, and we're seeing that his popularity is halved and plummeted. That is in terms of his personal popularity as Prime Minister. So we're seeing that their policies don't wash. They've been rejected by the public and the people at large. The people are obviously now standing strong and sturdy on the issues, and we've got the election in 2016. So if we're going to have I mean, obviously, this election, the bringing forth of it early, putting to Parliament of the the recent work there to bring about, try to get the Senate to agree to the ABCC. It was rejected outright. He didn't get. That was another rejection of Mr. Turnbull, another rejection of the LNP and their policies. And so now we're seeing that it was an excuse to bring on a double dissolution, that is to trigger an early election. Are they not desperate to bring on an early election because the popularity of Mr. Turnbull is rapidly shrinking, and they're in grave concern as they're now being backed into the corner and the walls are shrinking upon them. Len, your interpretation of the political situation and the dynamics here, please.
Yeah, I think they are desperate. I think that the right-wing establishment wanted to go ahead with the Abbott program of cuts to education, cuts to health, cuts to social welfare, a tax on workers' wages, penalty rates. They wanted that. They wanted that very much so, and they hoped that Abbott would be able to deliver. The Australian people's reaction was obvious. They've rejected that out of hand, and so what they're hoping now is that they can put a smiley face on it with Turnbull and still pursue the same policy agenda. And I think the population's starting to see through that fairly significantly, and let's hope the trend continues.
Well, I think the people are saying, are they not? It's starting to hurt. The pain is setting in. They're saying that 2.5 million people in poverty doesn't feel good. The pain is hurting there in the pockets. Starvation doesn't feel good, and when you've got a hurting gut from starvation, that leaves a bad taste in people's mouths, and of course that's going to cause them to vote against a government that does this to them. So we can see that this is what's being produced from this LNP, Liberal National Conservative government. The loss of jobs that was mentioned earlier, the 6.5% mass, the tumble, of course, in the polls, the public now in the readout, and the Ipsos polls that are coming forth now show that the public are turning against the government. As you look at the Mayday, and we look at the issues that are rising out of it, let's look at now in our wind up what the public can get involved in. The power lay with the people. Political and civil right and power lay with the people. This is what the whole message of Mayday has been. We've entrusted the government to rule on our behalf. They've betrayed the public and and the policies, public policies that is, and we're seeing that that too does not leave a good taste in people's mouths. The marches that are coming up, the events that are coming up, the Mayday events, this is an opportunity, is it not, to empower the public and the people, and for the people to start to step out and the people to take up the mantle and also to the direction of where the government should be going. We no longer have the trust, it appears, according to the stats and the data, in the political leadership at the moment. What does Mayday offer the public and the people in terms of direction? Can I have your comment, please?
Oh, if I could go, a chance to celebrate is what Mayday offers people, but also a rallying cry. So nothing speaks like feet on the streets. And while the LNP and the Conservative federal government have got big business in their pockets, we've got what money can't buy, and that is the hearts, souls, minds, and hopefully on Labor Day, the feet in there, thousands and thousands of working people right across Queensland. It's a great day, it's an exciting day, and it really, I guess, distills it all down to the fact that working Queenslanders don't want anything fancy. They want decent jobs, good working conditions and rights, and a plan for the future. They don't want waste, they don't want spin, and they don't want distractions, and they don't want snap polls. So that's what Queenslanders want, and that's what we're going to make sure that they get in abundance. Happy Mayday.
Yes, happy Mayday. Thank you for that, Ros, and that certainly gives us some good positive direction. Len, what do you think is...
Only one thing to add. I think Ros has summed it up beautifully. I just got one thing to add, is that the Melbourne Mayday is proud of the fact that it always asks the Aboriginal community to head the march, to lead the march, and we're doing the same this year, and let's hope they respond as well and join with us in demonstrating what we think of the current political situation.
Yes, indeed. We can say that simply because as Aboriginal people, we've known what it is to starve, to live in starvation conditions, and also to live at the hand of STASI-type practices in concentrated places called reserves and missions, and also to live against and up against elements of racism, and that is certainly jailed and imprisoned majority of population and whole families of Aboriginal people from John Howard's time onwards. So, these are people, we've got a lot in common with other Australians and all other Australians that have now been backed into the corner and that are on those low wages, whose families are being threatened with jail and prison when they should be getting good, adequate services and programs that should be provided as we all pay our taxes toward the maintenance and upkeep of a good, healthy public service in health and education and hospitals and a public service itself functioning. Would you like to suggest some websites that people can go to get some data and information? So we would like you to participate on May Day. We'd like you to participate with multicultural events. There's an annual Labor Day dinner at the Victorian Trades Hall Council on Friday the 29th of April at 7 o'clock. There's a website that you can go to, which is kmcclellan at vthc.org.au. And you can ring 96593511 to get further details on that. And there's the march on Sunday the 1st of May, and you're to assemble at 1 o'clock at the Trades Hall Council corner of Russell Street and Victoria Street here in Melbourne, Carlton. There's a family day and also a concert, and there's going to be some great speeches as well.
Yes. That's right. You summed it up nicely.
Excuse me. Pardon me. But I want to thank you very much indeed for joining me today. Listeners especially. And we need to be active. We need to be participants. We need to make our democracy work, and we need to assert our freedoms and liberties, and we need to assert them, particularly in this political and economic climate. I want to thank you very much for my guests here, both Ros and Len, for joining me and for being able to at least lay before you the issues as they confront us in 2016. Thank you for joining me, and don't forget to spread the message and involve others. This is our democracy, this is our nation, this is our future.
Thanks, Sharon.
Look at the front line of our struggle. The black youth hurry up to and join the huddle. We're proving truth to societies and trying to rubble.